Everybody knows about Abraham Lincoln and him being assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in April 1865. But do you know the strange story about what happened to his body after he died? Check this out. Everybody knows the story of Abraham Lincoln getting assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, April 15, 1865. And the story about what happened to his body afterwards is really weird, and it's kind of one of those things that hadn't been told much. I don't think it's general knowledge, but back in those days, embalming's been around a long time, but it wasn't really mainstream until the Civil War in the 1860s, when people wanted the bodies of the fallen soldiers to be brought back home. Embalming became more of a routine thing during the Civil War. So it was something that Abraham Lincoln was interested in, and he had his younger son embalmed and was buried in Washington, D.C. So when Lincoln died, he was embalmed more than once, and his body was preserved so he could go on this long train ride. So on April 21st, 6 days after he was assassinated, his body was placed onto a train car along with his son that had previously been buried in D.C. And they did a 1,600-mile train ride through a big part of the country, and they went through 400 different train stations, making stops in places like Philadelphia and New York, so the public could mourn the loss of the president. And he arrived in Springfield, Missouri on May 3rd, 1865, and he was placed into a receiving vault at the cemetery there in Springfield, Missouri. And then later that year, his body was moved. The receiving vault was just down the hill from where the permanent tomb would be. But in December of the same year, 1865, his body was moved about halfway up the hill from where the receiving vault is to where the tomb is now. And he was placed in a temporary tomb there. And he was there for 6 years. His body was in that temporary place for 6 years. And in 1871, his body and his 3 younger sons were moved to a crypt in the unfinished vault. And in 1874, when the tomb was completed, his body was placed in white marble sarcophagus in the center of the back room of the tomb. That's where Lincoln was in 1874. So that's almost 9 years after he died. He'd already been moved a few times. And the only thing protecting the public from President Lincoln's grave was one door with a padlock on it. So this is where it really gets crazy, okay? In 1876, a bunch of counterfeiters wanted to steal Abraham Lincoln's body and hold it for ransom, and they were going to ask for $200,000, which was $4 million today, and the release of a guy named Benjamin Boyd, which was a master counterfeiter at the time. Kind of an interesting story about that is Lincoln started the Secret Service to fight counterfeiting. They weren't started originally to be a presidential security or anything like that, which it might have been good if he'd had that night in April. So 11 years after he passed away, they conceived this plan to rob Lincoln's grave and steal his body and hold it for ransom. Well, the Secret Service had somebody embedded or an informant in their group, and so they knew about the plan. And the plan was to happen on November 7th, 1876, which was election night in America. So the police knew about it. They knew about the attempt, and the lock was broken, and they entered the vault, and they were able to pry the top of the sarcophagus off and move the casket a little bit in the attempt to take his body. But the casket was really heavy. It was made of a solid wood, and they I think they realized they didn't have the manpower they needed to move it. But anyway, they moved it a few feet, still in the sarcophagus. And the police showed up and ran them off. And they didn't catch anybody that night, but I think they caught some of them later. Anyway, somebody had broke into Lincoln's tomb and tried to steal his body. So the caretaker, which is a guy by the name of John Carroll, him and Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's surviving son, decided that it probably wasn't a good idea to have Lincoln there. But so that night, they replaced his coffin in the sarcophagus and sealed it back up. A week later, on November 15th, 1876, they opened the sarcophagus and moved Lincoln's casket out to the front entrance and down to the basement of the tomb. And they were going to bury him there inside the basement of the tomb. And when they tried to dig the hole, they realized that the water table was too high, and they were going to be putting him in water. So what they did was they put planks of wood on the ground and just covered his. They put him in a wooden crate and on planks of wood, and they just covered it up with a bunch of trash and debris and stuff. And that's where Lincoln sat for a long time, just in the basement. The public thought he was upstairs in the sarcophagus. So 2 years later, they didn't like that situation, so they found a spot in the corner of the basement, and they dug a shallow grave, making sure to stay above the water table. And they placed him in that shallow grave in the basement. That was 2 years later. That would have been in 1878. In 1882, Mary Todd Lincoln passed away, and she was placed in the crypt upstairs the day of her funeral. And that night, in secret, they went in and moved her body and dug a shallow grave next to her husband and put her in the basement with him. So he was in the basement, in the tomb, and there was nothing but debris and just, storage area down there. That's all it was. So in 1884, a portion of the tomb's foundation collapsed, and it took them all summer to repair it. But this John Carroll, the caretaker, was afraid that people were going to discover the problem, that Lincoln was not buried where everybody thought he was. He was downstairs. But they were able to get it done, and I'm not sure exactly what happened. They conceived a new tomb in 1887. Not sure if there was a tomb made then or not, but then in 1900, the tomb was in disrepair, and Lincoln's body, along with his family members, were moved outside. And that's when the public found out that Lincoln was not even in his tomb, that he had been buried somewhere else. And I believe that's when they opened his casket for the first time. That would have been around 1900. And he was placed in a temporary vault, him and his family, outside of where the tomb is now, while they could complete better construction of the tomb, which they did. And he stayed in that temporary vault for 18 months. And on September 26, 1901, the tomb was done, and they reopened Lincoln's coffin one more time, just to make sure that he was there and that there was no more shenanigans that going on. He had been moved so much. And they said he looked bronze in color. And then when they opened the casket, he still looked like Lincoln, this is 1901, so this is almost 40 years after he died, 36 years after he died. But he was bronze in color. He almost looked like the statues of himself. And there was a pungent smell, obviously, coming from the coffin. But a 13-year-old named Fleetwood Lindley, who died in like 1968 or something like that. He was 13 years old in 1901, and he was the last person to view Lincoln's body, to view Lincoln's face. But anyway, they sealed the coffin back up, and they decided that they were going to, do this once and for all. And they dug a hole where the sarcophagus was, and they put Lincoln 10 feet down and covered him with reinforced steel and concrete, and then placed the sarcophagus on top. So I know when I went through there probably 10 or 12 years ago to visit the tomb, I was under the impression, like most people, that Lincoln was inside the sarcophagus there in that back room. He's not. I think he's a foot or two to the front of the sarcophagus and 10 foot down is where his body actually is, and it's under 10 foot of reinforced steel and concrete. So Lincoln, it took Lincoln a long time to finally rest in peace. And I just found this story fascinating, that his body was moved so much, and that this is not a widely known story. I've considered myself a Lincoln fan and read books on the man, and I did not, when I went and visited him, back in the 2000s, I did not know that he was not there. So I thought I was standing within just a few feet of greatness, and I obviously was, but it was further than I thought. Anyway, I thought this was a crazy story, interesting story, but it took Lincoln a long time to rest in peace. Hope you liked the video. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe, and thank you for watching the video. Appreciate it. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. A truly great man who now belongs to the ages.